Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we're going to be continuing in our theme of breeding habitat updates from up in the prairies. And we're recording this here on June 11th. And people that are connected to what's happening in the waterfowl world will know that earlier this week, the North Dakota Game and Fish Department released the results of their 2021 North Dakota Breeding Duck Survey. And we have the pleasure of speaking with Mike Zemansky, the supervisor of North Dakota's Migratory Game Bird Management. So, Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Mike, thanks for having me.
You know, this is the second year that you and I have had this conversation. And while we within Ducks Unlimited and really everyone that cares about waterfowl are always interested in duck production, habitat conditions in North Dakota, it's been especially important here the last couple of years because it's been the only data-based barometer of what's happening pretty much anywhere in the prairies or pretty much anywhere in North America last year. I think there are a few exceptions to that this year, but we've had 2 consecutive years here of the cancellation of the larger U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service collaborative waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. So North Dakota is again in the spotlight as actually having some data, and it's a pretty different picture from what we saw last year. So results were released here earlier this week, and you know we're going to jump right into this. Last year we talked a little bit more about the survey design and things of that nature, and people can go back and find that episode if they want to. But I guess just for the basics, Mike, I'm going to turn this over to you right now, and just have you describe to us a bit about the survey and then some key takeaways from it.
Oh my, what a year will do, right? Last year we were scrambling to, figure out if we could even pull it off with COVID restrictions and everything that was going on. And we figured out a way to get it done last year in a slightly modified manner. And thankfully this year we were able to get back to our normal survey protocols. Yeah, it's our 74th annual survey. We started doing our North Dakota Game and Fish statewide breeding waterfowl survey in 1948. We run a little over 1,800 miles, 1,816 miles of transect that run north and south all across the state from South Dakota to Canada. And we run a 2-person crew doing roadside observations, 220 yards each side of the transect, counting every wetland basin that has water in it, all the duck species, and then breaking them down into social indices that, of course, go into, indicating whether or not you have a breeding pair there or an observed breeding pair, those types of things. And we did the survey basically a month ago. Now, of course, it was very dry and we had a very fast survey. So it only took about 3 days to complete across the state. But yeah, it was exactly a month ago we were running that and getting that data compiled.
Feel free to tell our listeners where they can get the actual report, but for this discussion, just give us some of the big highlights or lowlights, we might say.
Sure. Yeah, we've got a news release on our website that outlines it, along with a webcast that also gives the big overview. Big thing this year was the huge turnaround in wetland numbers and to really get a handle on what's going on in the Eastern Dakotas and especially North Dakota. You kind of have to step back to 2019. We had kind of a so-so spring for wetland conditions coming out of thaw, but then in late May, it just started raining and never stopped. Then we got 2 feet of snow in October, and then it rained some more and snowed some more during winter, and extraordinarily wet conditions the last half of 2019. So that carried into 2020 and left us with pretty darn good wetland conditions coming out of thaw. It was our 6th wettest count we had, sixth wettest wetland index on our May survey. That was in 2020, of course. Yeah. So then you walk into this year and complete opposite of last year, 100%, stopped raining in May, didn't rain anymore hardly. And then we had an open winter that was actually fairly warm too. So we didn't come out of winter with any runoff. And last fall we were drying up wetlands because of the dry conditions. So it's very unusual to be, drying up wetlands going into winter, and then as you come out of winter and even March and April, still drying up wetlands. And so when we did our wetland count this year, we only had a wetland index of about 208,000. That's our fifth lowest in 74 years. So on a percentage wise change, that's a 80% decrease in the wetland index, and our largest percentage based change ever in the history of the 74-year survey.
Let's talk a little bit about the waterfowl response to those low pond numbers. What just some highlights there on the some of the more notable declines that you would have seen in terms of that duck response, and then any sort of exceptions that surprised you when you were looking through the numbers.
Yeah, so it's interesting. These ducks. We, of course, us that are really into ducks, we know it and see it because there's all these different duck species. But a lot of times people just kind of think of ducks as being ducks, but they're all very different. And they kind of run the gamut of being early breeders versus late breeders. And our early breeding species were pretty quick to determine that North Dakota was not the place to be, trying to setting up a pair territory and going through the breeding process. So our mallard and pintail numbers were way down. Our pintail numbers were, extraordinarily down. We only had 80,000 pintails in our index. That's something like 67% or 68% below our long-term average. And that's kind of what they're known for. They're pretty quick to determine that they're going to maybe take a year off and not breed. That's sort of why we're in the pickle we are with managing them with special harvest management concerns. But mallards were way down. We only had 448,000 on our index. All of our other main species were down 40 to 50%. And then there was gadwall. And gadwall have done really well the last 2 years, owing to, late summer conditions that were pretty good. And they tend to use more semi-permanent basins for brood habitat. So they've been doing quite well, but they're also a later nesting species, one of our latest nesting species. So as they get up here, they haven't really quite sorted it out like the mallards and pintails have. And they were in just absolute social disarray when we were doing the survey. I've only seen that one other time. Of course, I've only been doing this for just about 20 years, but the last time I saw it was 2008 when we were very dry in the spring, kind of sandwiched in between a couple of wet years. And, they were all just kind of aggregated still, trying to figure out if they were going to leave, if they were going to stay. Didn't look like pair bonds were really holding very well. So, yeah, it's interesting to see that because you see these ducks going through their mannerisms and you can kind of see what's going to happen and what's not. And, without big time changes on the landscape for improvements in habitat conditions, most of those ducks just aren't going to breed.
It's been interesting speaking with people in places north of you. I spoke with Dr. Mike Anderson and Dr. Scott Stevens about the drought, the dry conditions that they're seeing in Prairie, Canada. And they've been making some similar observations about the numbers of birds of different species that they are seeing and their social behaviors as well. And it's very similar to what you're talking about here. Mike and Scott, I both made some comments about blue-winged teal, maybe a unusual number of blue-winged teal that they were observing in groups of birds, which is not what you would expect or like to see from a breeding waterfowl standpoint this time of year, whenever we were speaking with them. And that at that time, that's a pretty good indication that there's not a lot of water in North Dakota. Those birds just kept on flying, just trying to find water north of there. And as we've heard from those people, and we'll hear from others, it's pretty dry north of North Dakota as well.
Yeah, the blue-winged teal thing was very consistent in our numbers too. That was the common comment amongst all of our crews of, what really stuck out in your head, and they'd all kind of say, well, lots of gadwall and lots of blue-winged teal, all kind of jammed up on wetlands, and the blue-wings were sort of in the same state of affairs, except I thought they were still holding on to pair bonds a little bit better. So if maybe they get a chance to spread out again, they'll have a chance. Blue wings are pretty good getting things cranked out when the conditions are there. And again, they're another species that have done very, very well over the last couple of years in the Dakotas. And it's just an odd year to have all of your habitat go away, but still have all the ducks left over from the previous year, or what's left of the ducks from the previous year, after we go through hunting seasons and all that. But
yeah, Mike, that's an important point that I think we need to remind folks is that when we see drought occur on the landscape like this, you talked about last year was really wet in the Dakotas, and then we had good production out of the Dakotas last year. Now all of a sudden we come into a spring of drought where we have a historic decline in the number of wetlands on the landscape, and we see a pretty dramatic decline in the number of ducks there. That doesn't mean that the overall continental duck population has fallen by that 40% number or whatever it was. What we're seeing here are the results of birds responding to drought as it's occurring on the landscape, and they're moving, and we're counting them in different places. And it's really challenging this year because you're seeing a decline in the number of birds that are settling in North Dakota as a response to the dry wetland conditions, but lacking survey data from areas north of you, importantly lacking survey data from the boreal forest. It's impossible for us to say, well, what's the overall duck population look like right now? But the important thing probably worth mentioning is that just as you did, the past couple of years coming into spring and persisting back a few years, waterfowl populations, duck populations had been in good condition. So I think that's the one thing that's important to emphasize to folks we'll try to do is that although we've seen a pretty dramatic decline in wetland conditions this year, that doesn't mean that the ducks have magically disappeared along with that water, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're counting on what's left over from last year's ducks, and even, to some extent, the previous years before that. Ducks and duck production in the Dakotas is pretty good. So yeah, overall our duck number was 2.9 million, roughly. It was slightly over that, but that's a pretty big number of ducks, and that's still slightly above our long-term average for numbers of ducks in our North Dakota State Survey. I don't think we want to see things drop below the long-term average because we've been in this new paradigm of since late 1993, having a lot of water on the landscape. And then as we got through 94, 95, 96, having a lot of ducks, a lot of water. Our record number of ducks on our survey in North Dakota was about 5.4 million back in 2002. So we're a far cry from that. But again, our 2.9 million that we had this year was a lot of blue-winged teal. And the way blue wings work, that number is probably going to go down quite a bit next year. So we can expect probably a quite a bit lower duck number next year just because of lacking reproduction this year.
Yeah. And so, Mike, explain that a little bit. Why do we expect blue wings to perhaps have a more rapid or a larger negative response to a drought like this? What's different about them?
Sure. So generally speaking, blue-winged teal are sort of on this what we would consider to be more of an R-selected spectrum across our duck species versus a K-selected spectrum, meaning that they've generally got lower survival rates and higher reproductive outputs. So they're more reliant on their annual production and not annual survival versus something like maybe canvasbacks or pintails even. So yeah, as we go through a year or two here of maybe lower than average production for blue-winged teal, we'll see them go down in abundance for sure. And our number we had in North Dakota was still over 1 million blue-winged teal. That's a pretty big number.
So a big number of birds, but probably not expecting much production out of them because of the dry nature of that.
Well, yeah. And like we were kind of talking about with the conditions in North Dakota, a big part of it was our just extreme lack of ephemeral water, temporary and seasonal basins. Those are the basins that are most at risk for conversion and drainage. We did see a fair bit of that go on over this past winter too, unfortunately, with the open winter following a wet year. It seems like people maybe were after them a little bit more, but then with the dryness also setting in, there was just no ephemeral water out there. And those ponds are super important for setting up pair territories. And without that part of the process, breeding just doesn't happen. This is just one of those years where the probability of birds breeding on the front end was super low, and the propensity for their breeding is going to be super low. And that propensity is made up of renesting, probability of renesting. And that's all just going to be super low without those pair ponds out there.
Mike, it's not uncommon during any given year for us as we're talking with one another from biologists across different parts of the country, we're asking everyone in the prairies how wetland conditions are shaping up. We do this every year, kind of get these verbal reports even before we get survey data later in the year. And it's not uncommon at all, pretty much during every single year, with some exceptions, for people to talk about how, well, conditions are really good here, but over in the western part of the province or the western part of the state, it's pretty dry. We have some dry pockets there. So this phenomenon of drought, periodic drying of wetlands, it's not uncommon at all. It occurs almost on an annual basis in some area to varying degrees of severity across that prairie pothole landscape. So that's an important point that I think we're trying to communicate as we're going through this year, which is a little bit different because it's a year in which we're seeing a fairly widespread drought. That's the big difference that we're starting to see. Drought is not uncommon. It's part of a natural cycle. Typically occurs in pockets almost every year, but this is different. What did y'all see with regard to the widespread nature of the low pond counts and dry wetlands in North Dakota?
It kind of gets back to the writings by Johnny Lynch in an Escape from Mediocrity, where, you talk about the prairie pothole region being fairly large and quite dynamic. And of course, we can see how dynamic it is in the year-to-year change in wetland numbers we had in our North Dakota survey. But we're generally running seeing pockets of good habitat and bad habitat sort of regionally, even within North Dakota. A quarter of the state will be in decent shape and a quarter of the state might be really bad. And then the other half will be kind of so-so. So, generally Lynch wrote about, that would be kind of, maybe a yellow light year. And that's kind of how it is most of the time. Most of the time, some part of the PPR is not doing well and some parts doing really, really well. And the rest is kind of bebopping around in the middle. And then occasionally you have these just blockbuster years where it's a green light year and the whole thing's wet, top to bottom, super uncommon. And then you get into years that are possibly like this year. We don't know because we don't have survey information across the entire PPR. But I can say, even from a North Dakota standpoint, it's pretty rare for our entire state to be in a red light condition where everything's just very dry, very roughed up by drought.
Yeah, and so we've seen drought before. We've have a lot of experience with it, but it's been a while since we've seen one this severe, as we've kind of talked about here. And so naturally, people are going to start to wonder about what that's going to mean in terms of production and what that's going to mean in terms of what waterfowl hunters and others can experience this fall. I will pause and say that here we're talking about North Dakota and the results there, and we're challenged with the lack of any other empirical data. We'll have some from the Great Lakes states. A couple of those states we'll talk with, but they're outside of this dynamic prairie landscape. So that's sort of a different deal. But those states, when combined with the boreal forest north of across all of northern Canada, Alaska, and a few other areas that perennially produce ducks, support ducks, knowing what we do about the high productivity of the prairie region and what we are hearing with regard to how dry it is and what we know about how waterfowl respond to that, how are you gearing up, Mike, to communicate to your hunters and other constituents, hunters throughout the flyway, about what they could expect this year? I know that's a tough question, but it's one that we're expected to have an answer to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're kind of alluding to, again, some of the other portions of, Escape from Mediocrity with duck production and how important the boreal forest is and some of these other breeding areas like the Great Lakes states for kind of that backstop on production. Those places, if you're talking about money, they'd be the places that keep you from going broke or losing all your money at once. They're sort of that nice hedge. you're not going to make your way into a liberal package living off of the boreal forest and the Great Lakes states, but they're going to keep you from losing all your ducks, and they're going to keep some production in the system fairly consistently. So it's good that, ducks have an option to go back and settle into, and, they got to go somewhere. I mean, fact is ducks need water, and we're pretty short on the landscape of water just for them to even go through their annual process of molting and going through a flightless period, all those things. So, that said, I am pretty much telling people that they shouldn't expect a real great duck season in North Dakota, or even folks that are calling from other places where we send ducks to, because, that gets driven by reproduction. If there's not a lot of young birds in the fall flight, duck hunting's pretty tough, not only from the numerical standpoint of, when you have a good fall flight, you've generally, doubled your breeding population going into fall. If you're only hunting adult birds that have been hunted and sort of have, seen the movie before, they're not going to want to go back and do some of the things that they've done in the past where they got roughed up, or it's a long season.
Yeah, it is. And so I think what's easy to underestimate is just how young some of those birds are whenever you talk about the years in which we have good production. Those result in favorable hunting conditions from two perspectives. You noted both of them. One is the fact that you simply have more birds. In a good year, you'll double the population coming south from what you had in the spring. But the other is that there's a large portion of that would be young birds, naive birds. And by naive, we're talking about birds that have been on the wing for 45 days, probably maybe even shorter than that in some cases. So when we say naive, we're really, I think people don't really understand or don't appreciate how young they are in some cases. And so, yeah, that has a big effect on their vulnerability.
Sure. And I think the other part, and we're actually, some research partners and I are actually trying to get a look at this, is trying to figure out if there's this sort of notion, if it'll carry any water, that when you have duck production, those ducks don't always have other ducks to follow. Like, they just get up and go. They're generally going to some sort of natal, it's not natal area because it's not where they're born, but that sort of hardwired, primitive based wintering area that they're just going to end up there, and some of those places I just don't think are going to see as many ducks this year if there's not a lot of young birds that are just sort of pointing it south or southeast, going to where they are, generally expected to go.
I have a couple of final questions here for you, Mike, as we begin to close this out. We've talked about what hunters can expect, and so let's talk about the other aspect of that in terms of harvest regulations, and this is a point that we will hit on repeatedly, just as a reminder for folks, because there are some changes. There have been some recent changes to the timing of setting of harvest regulations. People that have been hunting for a long, long time will remember that we would always have to wait until the breeding population and habitat survey came out in the fall, and then that would dictate what the regulations would be for that year. But then things changed. That process changed a few years ago, where that now hunting regulations for, let's say, this year, 21-22, were set based on population and habitat conditions last year. And we still need to get someone on to talk in depth about why that is and the specifics of that. But just a reminder here that the conditions that we're seeing this year are going to be most important for setting harvest regulations for the 22-23 season. And so I'll get you to add anything to that you want to. But also just a reminder here, because I know people oftentimes ask me this, I'm sure they ask you this as well, are the North Dakota breeding duck numbers, survey numbers, factored into the annual AHM harvest regulation process?
No, they're not. We've always run our survey independently. We actually started our survey before the Fish and Wildlife Service started theirs, and it's just been run in a different manner, completely separate the whole time. There's been occasions where, coming into, say, teal season, taking a look at what teal season is going to be. If there's a big blip in teal numbers, we might compare numbers just to kind of make sure things are okay. Or it's just basically an independent data set that we use in-house as a communications tool, I have this data turned around generally and finalized within a couple of weeks. So we can start talking about our situation in the state to our hunters, not only within state and out of state, and then, have a good message for our biologists to talk about.
Two more questions. One relates to some recent precipitation that I know has been falling in certain parts of North Dakota. And I also know that you've been fielding some calls from people, maybe some emails with people asking you, hey, has this changed anything? Is it too late? Is it going to stimulate some late nesting? So yeah, what's that? How much precipitation have you been receiving? How widespread has it been? And what is how has it changed, or has it changed anything at all about wetland conditions and likely duck response?
Yeah. So, it's kind of a hard conversation because people on the duck side of things want to see a lot of rain show up and they want things to change. But the truth is we have to go through a little bit of short-term pain for long-term gain in wetland productivity. So it's good to have these wetlands dry up naturally on the landscape. What I fear with all of this is that, we've been going through some extremely hot temperatures. We've been triple digits a couple times now already in early June, which is highly abnormal. We're going to be triple digits again here this week. And we've generated some pretty big thunderstorms and very heavy downpours. And that's not really what you want to have hitting the landscape that's been roughed up by drought. And then, we had a lot of habitats that were tilled and converted to cropland because of the dryness. It's just a lot of places that people could get into that they haven't gotten into for a couple of years. So when you have a 4 to 7 inch rain, some places even got 10 plus inches, there's heavy soil erosion that happens. And instead of having water fill your wetland basins, you have topsoil going in. And that's highly detrimental to these ephemeral basins. We just had another blast of storms go through last night, and I haven't seen the results of what entails for precipitation amounts. But it seemed like the northwest part of the state probably got a fair bit of rain. The previous rains we had over the last week have largely been in not high duck density areas, generally places that maybe only have 20 or 30 duck pairs per square mile. That's what we consider to be a low duck density. We talk about our high density areas, the northwest part of the state, part of the Missouri Coteau, having an upwards of, some of the places are in upwards of 250 pairs per square mile. Generally it's over 100. So obviously those places getting rain will be helpful. It's hard to know how much it'll help some of these birds. The later breeding birds like gadwall will certainly benefit. The mallards that stayed here will probably benefit if it's in their localized area. And as they're waiting out better conditions, it's important to realize also that these rains that are happening are fairly localized. What came through last night was a little more broader scale. So we'll have to see what that did. Blue-winged teal will probably also benefit too, because they seem to be always kind of ready to jump after it. But again, we were basically completely dry, and we're going to be back into the triple digits here later this week. So it could just be a blip, where it comes through and causes a bunch of problems for people with heavy downpours, and then that's it. We really won't know, but it is honestly fairly late in the breeding season to be, hoping to save production for the year. I kind of think in North Dakota, the rain thus far has maybe moved it from being a 1 out of 10 production wise to maybe after last night, a 2 or 3 out of 10. Okay.
Well, that's interesting. Mike Anderson rated southwestern Manitoba as a 2 out of 10. Maybe, I think he said maybe a little less than 2 out of 10. So it's interesting that you guys are kind of on the same scale there.
I think they've had really similar drought conditions. Our conditions in North Dakota, from what I can tell, seem to be kind of floating up into that first maybe 80 miles of Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
We'll talk with Pat Kehoe here, I think, next week, and he's going to give us a perspective from across some of the more western provinces of the prairies. So we'll see how. I don't think it's hard to say, man. You hear all sorts of different reports, and without real data, it's very difficult to get observations on the same kind of scale, but that's just kind of what we're having to deal with right now. It's just observations from the field and just try to piece it together. It's dry. We know it's dry. It's just varying levels of dryness.
And it's perspective too, right? Like I grew up in North Dakota. I remember very well the drought of the late 80s, early 90s. And, even the last couple of years, 2019 being the exception, we'd have, younger biologists in the state going, oh my God, look at how dry it is. And it's kind of like, no, that's not dry.
Yeah, stick around, stick around.
Yeah, y'all watch this. This year is by all means very dry, or was very dry during May in North Dakota. Our record low May index was like 141,000. So we had 208 this year. I mean, it was ranked 5th, but there's not a lot of give between worst and what we had. So
yeah, this is one of those years, if we're making jokes about all sorts of social media memes, this is one of those where 2021 would be saying, hold my beer, talking to the 1980s or to some other more recent drought, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But the point that you made about soil erosion during these thunderstorms is another thing that oftentimes slips the mind of folks, and including myself. And it's another reason why retaining intact grasslands is so important for the entire integrity of that prairie pothole system. Pretty neat little intersection there with what you're observing and some of the importance of our conservation efforts. So last question, or looking forward here, acknowledging that we lacked data in 2020 from the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, and now here we are in 2021, a second consecutive year without data from that survey, which covers covers the very important prairie pothole region of the U.S., of Canada, the boreal forest in Canada, the western boreal forest, as well as the eastern boreal forest. There's no data has been collected across any of that landscape for the past couple of years. How excited are you, and how much are you looking forward to next year, assuming something else doesn't go haywire, but the prospect of getting back in the air, getting biologists back in the air and on the ground to actually collect the data that is so important for the management of this resource? Yeah,
I mean, I am certainly very eager, as well as all of my counterparts that do this type of work, to have the full-scale survey data available. I mean, it's been great that our state agency's been able to provide some real data, but yet for a smaller geographical area over the last 2 years. But yeah, this whole system that we work on is based on structured decision-making, informed decisions, and then having a set of objectives that we're trying to work off of to manage waterfowl harvests. And not having that population and habitat data makes people not only very uncomfortable, but just, I would say, sick to the stomach of just kind of muddling through this with the unknowns. And, the talented folks over in the Fish and Wildlife Service have been able to make it work through some modeling procedures. Thankfully, when we talk about our annual process and our monitoring programs, we have 3 horsemen that are in that monitoring process: our population habitat survey, our preseason duck banding, and our harvest surveys. And thankfully, we had the preseason duck banding intact for the most part, and our harvest surveys. Last year, we were able to reconfigure a little bit and get some folks situated in the Dakotas that were displaced from Canada that would normally run crews up there. And then, of course, our state agencies are also running banding operations along with the Central and Mississippi flyways. So we had all that good data to help us work through it. That helps get back to modeling what that population status is that's getting used in the AHM process. So, it's certainly better than nothing, but it'd be great to have the real thing. And, it's just a very unfortunate timing for all of this, as we're, not only without data, but still sort of new in prescribing duck regulations a year in advance. We started doing that with the 2016 season. It's not just dryness. I mean, North Dakota only has a little over 2.4 million acres of CRP in the state. Little less than 1.25 million acres. In 2007, 2008, we were pushing 3.4 million. it's a pretty big difference for duck production and what's going to happen, for duck nest success and all those things. Yeah, I mean, it's just a difficult situation for folks. What we do have to remember is that the SCIS process, even if we would have had that May survey information, I think folks are pretty much in agreement that we very, very likely would have had a liberal prescription for this hunting season. So now we're in the situation of, we've already got this year's hunting season set as a liberal package, but we don't have data again for this year. So the big question is what will come out of AHM as we go through the process later this summer. And I got to say, with conditions being what they were in the Dakotas, which are not factored in currently, but how conditions also were in Canada and kind of all that all feeds together with age ratios, predicted populations, predicted pond counts. Like, it's hard to know what'll come out. I suspect it'll probably be a change, but who knows?
It's definitely a weird time. Although we feel like the global pandemic is ending, there are things left in its wake that we're going to have to deal with for another year or two. But folks like yourself and the partners in the Fish and Wildlife Service are the ones that are very capable of doing so. And I'm glad we've got you all in those positions. And the other thing is that we have to remember is that the drought that we're talking about here in the prairies is going to have its greatest impact on populations that feed waterfowl hunters and resource users in the Central and Mississippi flyways, harvest regulations there. And then we haven't talked very much about harvest regulations and how they're set and what habitat conditions and populations are kind of doing or likely to be doing in the eastern North America and western North America. Those mallard stocks are managed separately, so there's a whole other piece of this conversation that we're going to try to take care of. And I think the Fish and Wildlife Service was actually able to fly surveys in Alaska to help feed that western mallard AHM process, right, Mike?
Yeah, that was my understanding, and that's actually a very interesting thing for pintails because of the overflight that happens when the prairies are dry. A lot of times they end up in Alaska, so it'll be interesting to see how many pintails they pick up in that survey effort. Yeah,
that's a good point. So the complexity here is pretty. It's fascinating to us. And we're going to try to bring a view of some of that complexity to you, the listeners, here as we go forward. We're going to try to connect with some folks out east and then maybe some folks out west as well to speak to some of that. And then, of course, any survey data that does result from those Alaska surveys, we'll bring that to folks later in the year and continue to piece together this pretty interesting conversation that and process that we all find ourselves working through right now. But, Mike, thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot more about some of the things that are occurring there. Your perspective being there on the ground is really important. So I appreciate that, and I hope our listeners do as well. So thank you for joining us, Mike, and thank you to your agency for continuing to keep that data stream going. It's pretty useful in a year like this, especially.
Thank you, Mike. Absolutely glad to join you.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Mike Zemansky, the Supervisor of Migratory Game Bird Management for the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does in this podcast and getting it out to you. And then to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.